Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1982. Today, we're going to talk about the honorable mentions of 1982. In 1982, Buckner and Garcia released the Pac-Man Fever album. Every song on the album was inspired by a video game. Included in that would be songs about Frogger, Centipede, Donkey Kong, Asteroids, Defender, and Berserk. After the success of the song Pac-Man Fever in 1981, the album also proved to be successful when it was fully released in January 1982. The album went on to sell 1.2 million copies by the end of 1982. In 1982, Online Systems officially renamed itself to Sierra Online. Online Systems was responsible for Mystery House and The Wizard and the Princess, each of which had their own videos. Online Systems had been using the Sierra name and logo on their products previously, but in 1982, the name was officially changed. In the world of comic books, DC Comics began publishing Atari Force comics in 1982. DC Comics and Atari were both subsidiaries of Warner Communications at the time. These comic books were designed to illustrate the storylines behind some Atari 2600 video games. We have talked about one of these comics before, in our video on Yar's Revenge. Several games ported to the Atari 2600 in 1982 would include an Atari Force mini-comic with the game. On December 27, 1982, TBS aired Starcade on television in North America. Starcade was a game show in which contestants played video games. The show would start with a toss-up question. The player who guessed correctly would then pick a video game to play, trying to get as many points as possible. Their opponent would then play the same game to get as many points as they could. This would last for 3 rounds, with each round played on a different video game. After 3 rounds, the player with the most points would move on to the bonus round. There, they would have to play one of the remaining video games and have to beat a certain score in order to win the grand prize. Starcade would be the first video game-based game show, but it would inspire others. Let's turn to computers. In 1982, Commodore discontinued their Commodore PET computer. Initially released in 1977, the Commodore PET helped open up the home computer market. However, by 1982, the computer saw more powerful competitors reach the market, including Commodore's VIC-20 computer. The Commodore PET saw over 200 video games released for it. Among the highlights are Temple of Apshai, and ports of Breakout, Pong, Space Invaders, and Millipede. In October 1982, Japanese computer company NEC released the PC 9801. The 9801 ran on an Intel 8086 microprocessor with 128 kilobytes of RAM, and room for up to 640 kilobytes of RAM. It could also display 8 different colors on the monitor. While expensive, selling for around $1,200 in 1982, over $3,400 in 2022, the PC 9801 was very successful in Japan, quickly dominating the home computer market. Let's look at the other home consoles of 1982. In May 1982, Emerson Radio released the Arcadia 2001 in North America. The Arcadia 2001 is a lower-end console, selling for just $99, over $280 in 2022. It came with 2 controllers inspired by the Intellivision console. The console itself did not prove to be popular, with critics stating that the graphics were similar to the Atari 2600, which came out 5 years earlier. The original plan was to release the console with 19 games, but Atari started cracking down on violations of their intellectual property, so many games were cancelled. What games were released were typically clones of arcade games, including clones of Breakout and Defender. Bandai would release their own variant of the Arcadia 2001 in Japan in 1982, named the Bandai Arcadia. This console would see 4 exclusive games, all based on Japanese manga and anime. Despite its lack of success, the Arcadia 2001 would see several unlicensed clones released around the world. In November 1982, General Consumer Electronics released the Vectrex in North America. The Vectrex is a vector-based home console, launched in time for the holiday season at a relatively low price of $199, over $570 in 2022. The Vectrex, unlike most consoles, came with its own screen built into the system. It also came with a built-in game, an asteroids-inspired game named Mindstorm. Other games would come with their own overlays, similar to the original Magnavox Odyssey. The Vectrex proved to be successful and popular among the critics. One of the highlights of the console was the lineup of games. By the end of 1982, there were 14 games for the Vectrex, all either developed or published by General Consumer Electronics. Most of these were ports of existing arcade titles. Among them were ports of Berserk and Scramble. Let's look at some of the other video games of 1982. In February 1982, Atari released Haunted House for the Atari 2600, designed by James Andreessen. In this game, the player explores a haunted house and tries to reassemble an urn before escaping. Critics at the time seemed to enjoy the game, who enjoyed how tense the game was with its dark rooms. Sales of the game, though, were not very high. On March 13th, 1982, Bally Midway released Pac-Man Plus to arcades in North America. This third entry in the Pac-Man franchise is very similar to the original Pac-Man. Some slight alterations to the game include having the ghosts move more quickly and more aggressively, and having the power pellets sometimes have random effects. On June 3rd, 1982, Mattel Electronics released Utopia for the Intellivision. Utopia is a city-building strategy game designed by Don Daglow. This 2-player game pits the players against each other as they try to build a civilization on their island to build points. After a predetermined amount of turns, the player with the most points wins the game. Although the game was not very successful at the time, the game's impact and legacy has grown with time, with many seeing the game as laying the foundation for an entire genre of video games. In 1982, Parker Brothers released Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back for the Atari 2600, the first licensed Star Wars game. In the game designed by Rex Bradford, the player plays as Luke Skywalker, who must use a snowspeeder to fight off Imperial AT-ATs on the planet Hoth. The game proved to be a success for Parker Brothers, selling 1 million copies, although the game received mixed reviews from critics. In 1982, Stern Electronics released Frenzy to arcades. Frenzy, designed by Alan McNeil, is the sequel to Stern's 1980 arcade game Berserk. Once again, the game has the player exploring a maze, shooting robots. However, the game was made more difficult. The game proved to not be as successful as Berserk. In 1982, Coleco released Smurf, Rescuing Gargamel's Castle to the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision. Based on the TV show The Smurfs, the player plays as a Smurf, and, just as the name suggests, the player attempts to rescue Smurfette from Gargamel's castle. The game, particularly the ColecoVision version of the game, was received well by critics, particularly for its graphics and sound. In 1982, Thinking Rabbit released Sokoban in Japan for NEC PC8801 computers. This puzzle game has the player take on the role of a warehouse worker. The goal is to move the boxes in the warehouse to the specified spots on the level. However, the warehouse worker can only push boxes forward. The game has 50 difficult levels for the player to play, with each level easily taking an entire session to complete. In 1982, Taito released Qix 2 Tournament to arcades. This slight upgrade to the original Qix would give the player an additional life if the player was able to clear over 90% of the screen. It did not do nearly as well as the original Qix. In 1982, Synapse Software released Shamus to the Atari 400 and 800 computers. This game, designed by Catherine Mataga, is a shooter inspired by Berserk. In it, the player travels through a maze destroying robots and collecting items. Unlike Berserk, Shamus has an ending, when the player can collect keys and make it through all 4 levels, although the difficulty of the game makes this a very challenging task. In 1982, Online Systems, as it was still known at the time, released Time Zone for the Apple II. This graphic adventure game has the player travel through time to solve puzzles and complete a quest. The game was released on 6 floppy disks, when most games could fit on a single disk. This would require a team of programmers to develop, led by Roberta Williams, who also wrote the game. This also forced the game to be sold at $99, $285 in 2022. Making it an incredibly expensive video game. The game received mixed reviews, with critics praising the game's scope, but seeing the gameplay as a weakness. In 1982, Synapse Software released Necromancer to the Atari 400 and 800 computers. This game, designed by Bill Williams, has the player control the wizard Illuminar in 3 distinct stages. In the first stage, the wizard plants magical seeds and must protect them from orcs while they grow into trees. In the second stage, the player uses the surviving trees to crush spider eggs while descending through the vaults. In the third stage, the player fights Tetragorn in a graveyard, and any surviving spider eggs will now hatch spiders to fight the player. In July 1982, Imagic published Atlantis for the Atari 2600. Designed by Dennis Kogel, Atlantis is a fixed shooter. The player plays as the city of Atlantis and must defend the city against the Gorgon invaders. The game would be very successful, selling over 1 million copies. Imagic held a contest for the game where the players could take pictures of their high scores and send them in to get a copy of Atlantis 2, a special edition of the game that was more difficult. On September 26, 1982, Namco released Super Pac-Man to arcades in Japan. This game in the Pac-Man franchise took the gameplay in a new direction. This game has Pac-Man finding keys, which unlock doors to rooms full of fruit. Those fruits must be eaten to clear the level. The power pellets from the first 2 games are present in Super Pac-Man as well, but new super pellets are also present. These super pellets will grow Pac-Man, who then will be able to open doors, travel at super speed, and completely ignore the ghosts. Also on September 26, 1982, Sega published Pengo to arcades in Japan. This maze game has the player play as Pengo, who must defeat his enemies, the Snow Bees, by pushing ice blocks and crushing them. The game did prove to be successful, selling 2,000 cabinets in the United States. It was also well reviewed by critics at the time. In October 1982, Atari released Sword Quest Earthworld for the Atari 2600. Originally designed as a sequel to Adventure, Sword Quest Earthworld was the first game in a series of Sword Quest games that Atari published as part of a large puzzle. Should players solve the puzzles in the game, they would get a clue to the larger Sword Quest puzzle. The game itself included a mini-comic in the Atari Force line with it, as well as an instruction manual, both of which would help provide story and help with the clues of the game. Should the players solve the puzzle and submit the solution to Atari, they would go to Atari headquarters to play a special version of the game for a chance to win the Talisman of Penultimate Truth, an 18-karat gold disc studded with 12 diamonds and 12 birthstones, as well as a miniature white gold sword set, valued at over $25,000, over $72,000 in 2022. This player would then have a chance to compete for a larger prize once all the other games were released. Atari received over 5,000 entries for Earthworld, but only 8 were correct. Atari flew those 8 players out to Atari headquarters in 1983, when we will continue talking about the story of Sword Quest. On November 11th, 1982, Konami released Time Pilot to arcades in Japan. Designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, Time Pilot is a multi-directional shooter in which the player pilots a fighter jet in several different time periods. Each period has a mothership that must be destroyed before moving on to the next time period. The game proved to be popular in Japan and fairly successful in the United States. In November 1982, Atari released Raiders of the Lost Ark to the Atari 2600. Designed by Howard Scott Warshaw, the creator of Yar's Revenge and the E.T. video game, this game has the player control Indiana Jones in his quest for the Ark of the Covenant, following the plot of the 1981 film. This complex game would not sell particularly well, and received mixed reviews from critics. In November 1982, Microsoft released Microsoft Flight Simulator to IBM PCs. Designed by Bruce Artwick of Sublogic, who had designed a previous flight simulator, Microsoft Flight Simulator has the player fly a Cessna 182 in different regions of the United States in a realistic simulation. The game was reviewed well at the time. On November 18th, 1982, Nintendo released Popeye to arcades in North America. Designed by Genyo Takeda and Shigeru Miyamoto, this game uses the characters from the Popeye the Sailor Man comic strip and animated cartoons. Popeye is a platform game in which the player plays Popeye, who must collect a certain number of items in each level while avoiding the Sea Hag, Brutus, and other obstacles. The game was reviewed relatively well, although the gameplay was seen as similar to too many other games of the time. 1982 also saw a lot of ports of games we have already featured. The most important port of 1982 is the port of Pac-Man to the Atari 2600. Pac-Man was arguably still the most popular arcade game at the time, despite being originally released 2 years earlier. Todd Fry, working for Atari, was put in charge of porting Pac-Man to the console. Fry took 6 months to complete the port, which was released in North America on March 16, 1982. However, due to the limitations of the console, the game had to be simplified from the original version, both in technical design and in gameplay. Atari anticipated the port of Pac-Man to be an enormous success. It is estimated that Atari produced 12 million cartridges of the game. Atari bolstered the release with a large advertisement campaign, spending $1.5 million promoting the game, over $4.3 million in 2022. This resulted in over 1 million cartridges being sold in the first month after release. By the end of 1982, over 7 million units of the game were sold, making the game the top seller for the Atari 2600 and the best-selling home video game to that point. Todd Fry would make 10 cents for each of these units sold. However, the game was not good. Both the critics and the general audience were disappointed in the game, seeing it as a far worse version than the arcade version. Even by the summer of 1982, the game could be found in large quantities unsold on the shelves. The public perception of the game soured quickly. Atari also ported Pac-Man to the Atari 5200, finishing it in time to make it a launch title for the Atari 5200. While this version was closer to the original arcade version, it was not nearly as successful as its 2600 counterpart. Berserk saw two ports in 1982. Berserk was ported by Atari to the Atari 2600 and ported by Western Technologies to the Vectrex. Burger Time was ported to the Atari 2600 in 1982. This version of the game would sell over 500,000 copies. Centipede saw two ports in 1982. Atari ported Centipede to both the Atari 2600 and Atari 5200 that year. The Atari 2600 version would sell over 1.3 million copies. Crazy Climber was ported to the Atari 2600 and the Arcadia 2001 in 1982. Atari ported the game to the Atari 2600, while the Arcadia 2001 version was published by UA Limited. Defender was also ported in 1982. Atari ported the game to both the Atari 2600 and Atari 5200. The Atari 2600 version of the game would sell over 1 million copies. Demon Attack was ported to the Intellivision and Atari computers in 1982. The Intellivision version was ported by Gary Kato, while the Atari computer version was ported by Dave Johnson. Donkey Kong saw several ports in 1982. On top of being one of the main selling points of the ColecoVision, Donkey Kong was also ported to the Atari 2600 and Intellivision in 1982 by Coleco. The Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong would sell over 4 million copies. Coleco would advertise the game with a television commercial, the first commercial to use the Mario character, giving him his first voice.
Game system. Don't worry, darling! I'll save you! Help me! Oh!
Frogger was ported to the Atari 2600 in 1982. Parker Brothers purchased the rights to make cartridge versions of the game and ported the system to the Atari 2600. This version would sell over 2.2 million copies. Galaxian was ported to the Atari 5200 and Atari computers in 1982. Both versions were ported by Atari, 3 years after the initial release of the game in arcades. Missile Command was ported to the Atari 5200 in 1982 as well. Ported by Atari, this version was practically identical to the Atari computer version that came out in 1981. Pitfall was ported to the Intellivision in 1982. After the huge success of the Atari 2600 version, the Intellivision version, being on a more powerful console, was seen as a disappointment. Kix was ported to the Atari 5200 in 1982. Ported by Atari, this version would retain the cult hit status of the original. Scramble was ported to the Vectrex in 1982 by General Consumer Electronics. The overlays for the game were praised, although the game was seen as more difficult than the original. Space Invaders was ported to the Atari 5200 by Atari in 1982. The hope was that one of the best-selling Atari 2600 games could help the sales of the struggling Atari 5200 console. Star Raiders was also ported to the Atari 2600 and Atari 5200 in 1982. The Atari 2600 version was ported by Carla Meninsky and came with its own special controller that would end up only being used for this one game. The Atari 5200 version was ported by Joe Copson and is typically seen as an improvement on the original. Zaxxon was ported to the ColecoVision and the Atari 2600 in 1982. While the ColecoVision version was closer to the original arcade game, the Atari 2600 version changed the game's perspective to behind the ship instead of the isometric perspective. Overall, the Atari 2600 saw over 140 more games released for it in 1982, only 22 of which were published by Atari. Remember that in 1981, the console had just over 60 games, meaning that in 1982, the library of the Atari 2600 more than tripled to over 200 games total. The Intellivision saw 29 more games released for it in 1982, 12 of which were released by third-party developers, the first for the console. This brings its total to 57 games. The Intellivision would be more widely distributed in 1982, reaching more parts of Europe, Japan, and even South Africa. However, Mattel had to cancel the keyboard component of the Intellivision. Mattel, with their repeated delays of the keyboard component, was facing fines from the Federal Trade Commission for false advertising and fraud, and canceled the keyboard component altogether to stop the fines. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 saw 11 more games released in 1982, bringing its total to 47 games. The console would also be released in Japan in 1982. The Bally Astrocade only saw 2 more games released in 1982, bringing its total to 26 games. The Game & Watch series continued in 1982, releasing 8 more games that year, bringing its total to 23 games in the line. By far the most successful game was Donkey Kong, which sold over 8 million units. Donkey Kong was one of several games in a new style. These units had 2 different screens to show the action. Donkey Kong in particular also had a new method of control for the character. Instead of a joystick, 1 button, or 4 buttons to move the character, the system used a plus-shaped set of buttons, known as a D-pad, that would allow the player to move the character in 4 different directions based on how the plus is tilted. This small innovation would prove to be very important to the history of video games, and we will keep an eye on the D-pad as we continue. As a whole, the video game industry was very large. It is estimated that the US arcade video game market was worth $4.3 billion in 1982, over $12.3 billion in 2022. The US home video game market was not far behind, estimated to be worth $3.8 billion in 1982, over $10.9 billion in 2022. The Japanese home video game market was not far behind either, estimated to be worth $3.7 billion in 1982, over $10.6 billion in 2022. That will do it for the honorable mentions of 1982. My name is Baller Scuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we look back at 1982.